Hello everyone. Today I'm going to give a message about Bible basics. This is part one of a two-part message. And I'd like to start the message off with just a quick point that I'd like to make, and that's that I'm not an expert on the Bible. I've read the Bible a lot, I've studied the Bible, but I'm definitely not an ordained minister or someone who considers themselves to be qualified to teach the Bible in detail and in depth to anyone. What I intend to do with this video is really just give a basic understanding of the Bible. Now, if you are someone who's well educated in the Bible and knows a lot more about it than I do, I would still encourage you to watch this video, because you may run into some people down the road or know some people who don't have a basic understanding of the Bible, don't know the Bible at all, who may benefit from watching these two videos. So I'd encourage you to stay. And if you're someone who hasn't read the Bible much, or doesn't really know much about the Bible, or doesn't know anything about the Bible, I think this would be a really good time investment for you to just get a basic overview, a Bible basic overview, with these two videos that I'm going to share with you. So I'd like to start the message today by first of all telling you what I believe the Bible is. To me, the Bible is an accurate historical book. It's a book about an eternal relationship, and it's a book that's alive and about life, truth, and instruction. That's what I believe the Bible is. And where I'd like to begin that is, I'd like to begin it just by going over some basic facts about the Bible. Most people think that somebody sat down at some point in history and spent a year or two or 5 or whatever years writing the Bible. Well, that's not how the Bible came about. The Bible came about by a group of people over a 1,500-year period, okay? Took 1,500 years to complete the writing of the Bible. It was written on 3 different continents, and when I say a group of people to write the Bible, the Bible has over 40 different authors, okay? And these authors are kings, priests, fishermen, murderers, prisoners, people from a very diverse backgrounds were the authors of the 66 books that comprise the Bible today. Now, the key point, though, to understand, and this is what I believe, is that all of these people, when they sat down to write the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible, their writing was inspired by God. And that in fact, when they were writing, that God was using them as the instrument where He would be able to communicate His word to them through the power of His Spirit, for them to write the words that they wanted, that He wanted to have put into that Bible. Now, the 66 books of the Bible are comprised of 39 Old Testament books, history, prophecies, songs and poetry, wisdom and stories, and 27 books in the New Testament, 4 Gospels, Book of Acts, 20 letters, and the Book of Revelation. So the Bible is a big picture inspired by God, put together from a lot of different pieces, a lot of different books involving a lot of different people, and that's what comprises the Bible that we have and that we read today. Now, when I say it's an accurate historical book, I'm not going to go in depth in this, because you can read about it in a lot of books I have. You can read about it easily on the internet, but I believe that the Bible is historically accurate for me for 3 different reasons. I'm not going to go into detail. First of all, it's historically accurate because of other complementary writings that took place at the same time the Bible was being written that document a lot of the same people and facts and things that are described in the Bible. The second reason I believe that it's an accurate historical document is that over the past couple hundred years, we've had a lot of evidence through archaeology that's uncovered a lot of facts and a lot of things that validate the things that took place, the people, places, and events are validated by what we're finding archaeologically. And there's still archaeological digs going on in the Bible areas today, especially in Israel, where they continue to find more and more evidence that the Bible, what's portrayed in the Bible, was actual events. The third point that I believe is that it's historically accurate because of prophecy. Okay, the Bible, and when I say prophecy, it's kind of the predictions that are made in the Bible. And a lot of predictions in the Old Testament and some predictions in the New Testament, but it's accurate because a lot of these predictions that were made in the Bible have come true and can be proven that what the Bible says is going to happen actually happened. And even in the New Testament, where there's things and predictions that were made in the New Testament that actually happened in time. So that's the first part of the Bible that I wanted to mention, and that is the historical accuracy of the Bible. Now, for me, the most important thing I believe about the Bible is that it's a book about an eternal relationship. And for me to talk about that, I have to flip the board over, so hang on with me. Okay, when I talk about it's a book of an eternal relationship, that eternal relationship, I call it God's relationship with man through time. And what I mean by that is that God has desired, He created man with a desire to have a relationship with man. And that relationship happens in time. Now, I used to ask the men in prison and jail, what was kind of a trick question. I'd say, what's the first thing God created? Because I'd say, first Genesis 1 says God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And they would say, the heavens and the earth. And I'd say, well, that's what it says, but the first thing it says is in the beginning. Well, in the beginning of what? In the beginning of time. So God created time, which when he created earth, He created time, and we measure earth. So earth's spinning around in a circle, and then the earth spinning around the sun. And that's how we measure time. So all human existence and all the creation that God talks about in the Bible has been created, and we've measured the time of that creation based on spinning earth, spinning around the sun. And as a Christian culture, we measure that time, the passage of that time, in two ways. We measured it BC, which is the time before Christ, from creation up until Christ comes into the world. And then we measure the time, and we measure that kind of backwards for us. It goes from the bigger number down to the smaller number, down to 0. But for the time after Christ is born, AD, after He was born, we measure time from 0 out to where we are today, 2022. And all those times are measured based on Earth spinning around the sun. So that's time. God created man, first first people in creation, Adam and Eve. He created man because God wanted to have a relationship with men. And he wanted to have an eternal relationship with men. So when he created Adam and Eve were created to live an eternal life. But when God created man, he created man and gave that man free will. Just like it's been passed along, just like all of us have, all men, me, all of us have had free will. But man used that free will when he was in paradise, in the Garden of Eden. He used that free will to reject what God told him not to do. He said, don't eat from, the tree of knowledge. They ate from the tree of knowledge. They broke that relationship they had, that eternal relationship they had with God. And what happened then was that because of that, sin entered into them. Sin entered into man. And that sin, along with our freedom to choose, has been in every man that's existed since then, every person that's existed since then. So we've all inherited that sin nature that was created at the time of creation. Now, that's getting into talk of creation and talking about the beginning of time, beginning of times with man on earth. Time out. Let's talk really quickly about, where that book, Genesis, that talks about that came from, okay? It wasn't written when those events were happening. Actually, the first 5 books of the Bible weren't even written until about 15 to 1400 BC. So, at that point, they were written by a guy named Moses, I'll talk about later. But he wrote down, God inspired him, and he wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? First 5 books of the Bible. He wrote at about 1500 to 1400 BC. So he's describing what took place from creation all the way up to that point in time, or almost that point in time. So he's describing that. How's he describing it? Well, there could have been a lot of stuff going on earth during that time. It could have been, and probably was, I don't know, thousands, maybe millions of years took place. But he doesn't talk about all of that, okay? Because that's not what the Bible's about. It's not about dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. The Bible's about God's relationship with man through time. So the Bible talks about, and Moses writes about in those books, the creation, the beginning of time, and God's relationship with men through that time. Now, just a quick word about what I call ancient man, okay? From creation up till about 2100 BC, I don't know how long that was, okay? But the way God describes it, he describes people and certain events that were taking place during that time that he instructs Moses to write down in the book of Genesis, okay? And he talks about that in the first 10 and a half to 11, up to 11 chapter of the book of Genesis. And when I talk about that, he's involved with men, but it's ancient. For me, it's ancient men. So we don't know. There's not a lot in the Bible that is actually written about them and the events. I mean, it's got Noah's Ark and Tower of Babel and things like that, which, obviously God was involved with those men and those events. Okay, and there's a message in those men and those events, but we don't see God in the writing of the first books of the Bible talk about any specific relationship, maybe a little bit with Noah, but certainly the specific relationship that God makes in the 11th chapter and on of Genesis with a man named Abraham. Okay? And at that time, God chose Abraham, he says, because he had faith, and he chose him, and he said, I'm going to make a promise. I'm going to make an agreement with you that because of your faith, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless, all your generations afterwards. Okay? So that happens in Genesis. So God's having a relationship from that point forward with a specific man and his family, his eventually big family. Okay? So after Abraham, he has a son named Isaac. He has a son named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Genesis talks about all of that. At the end of Genesis, you've got the 12 sons of Jacob. 12 becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob living in Egypt. They leave the land that they were living in, and they end up in Egypt. Okay? They live in Egypt, and then we have the book of Exodus. And Exodus talks about what happens to them when they're in Egypt. They multiply. They turn into over 1 million people. The Egyptians get afraid of them. They conquer them. They put them into slavery. So the people that God's having this relationship with are living in slavery in Israel, and it's miserable. Okay? So that's when God takes this guy named Moses. Okay? Moses was an Israelite. Was a Hebrew person. Okay? I use the term Jewish, Hebrew, Israelite kind of interchangeably, so just so you know when I say that, I'm talking about the same group of people. Okay? So he chooses Moses, and Moses actually grows up in Pharaoh's court, very well educated, very smart guy, but he commits a murder when he's 40 years old, and he runs away, runs out into the desert, and he stays out in the desert or the wilderness for 40 years, and then God calls him to come back to bring God's people out of Egypt and bring them to a promised land, which he does in the book of Exodus. Okay, and he brings them out into this wilderness on the way to the promised land, and they end up staying in the wilderness for 40 years, where God does miracle after miracle in order to provide for them and take care of them during that time period. Other complicated aspects of the story, but he's taking care of them during that time period. And during that time, God calls Moses and says, okay, I want you to write down this book of Exodus, which talks about the people leaving Egypt and going out into the wilderness and heading for the promised land. And then I want you to write the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which in those books, through Moses, God is describing what we call the law, and the law includes a system of sacrifices. Now, God has Moses write all these things down, and he tells Moses, and through Moses communicates to the people that he says, if you follow these laws, and if you honor this system of sacrifices that I set in place and follow those, I'm going to not only bless you, but I'm going to make you righteous, give you a chance to be righteous in my eyes. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Well, when Adam and Eve committed the first sin, that sin nature separated man from God. And the reason it separated man from God was because God's a loving God. Okay? Today you hear a lot of people talking about God is love, God is pure love. Oh, God, do what you want. God's going to love you. Be what you want to be. God's going to love you. No matter what happens, God's going to love you. Do what. No, it's not what the Bible says. The Bible says God's two things. He is a loving God. He is pure love, but he's a righteous God. And God says, I'm going to give you these rules and this system of sacrifice that you have to follow. And if you follow it, I'll bless you. And because of that, that sacrificial system, which means animal sacrifices, the animal's blood due to the sacrifice, will cover your sins in my eyes, and I won't be able to recognize those sins. I won't see those sins because of your adherence to the law and your system of sacrifices, and therefore you'll be righteous in my eyes through that. And I'll bless you, and we'll have that relationship that I want to have with you. So he gives that system to them Moses writes it down while they're out in the wilderness, and then they go to take the land. They go to take the promised land. Now Moses doesn't get to go in with them to take the promised land, but when they go in to take the promised land, we get to it's around 1500 BC, 1400 BC, and that's the book of Joshua. And Joshua was the leader of the people that the 12 tribes that were the original sons of Jacob. Those 12 tribes, over 1 million or almost 2 million people, going into the land promised land to take the land. And Joshua was leading them to do that. And God said, if you follow my rules and you follow my regulations, my system of sacrifices, I'm going to go before you and I'm going to defeat your enemies. And I'm going to give you their towns, their cities, their homes, their farms, their vineyards, their livestock. I'm going to give it all to you, but you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to drive them all out of there, okay? And then you'll be able to take over, and we'll have this righteous relationship together with you in that promised land. So at the beginning, that's exactly what happened, okay? In the book of Joshua, they go in and they do that, and God is with them, and God helps them. But they didn't drive out all the people. And they left some of the people in the land. They left a lot of the people in the land. And they ended up settling and living with the people and near the people in the land. And those people weren't having a relationship with God. Those people were pagans. They were worshiping their pagan gods and doing sacrifices to their pagan gods and doing all kinds of sexual, evil, bad things that to worship in a way to worship their gods, okay? That God said in his law and in his rules, he said, no, you can't do that. That's evil in my eyes. That's bad. If you do that, not only is it going to affect our relationship, but it's bad for you, and it's going to have bad consequences for you. Well, the book of Joshua ends, and then the book of Judges begins, okay? And then the people are in the land, and in the beginning of the book of Judges, it says that the generation that knew the Lord and saw his miracles in the wilderness and saw him conquer the land ahead of the people, that generation died. And the generation or generations that rose up after him didn't know or remember those things, and they started to fall away from God and fall away from following the laws and the system of sacrifices that God had given them. So we have a 400-year period then called the Book of Judges up to 1000 BC. And during that time period, we had 12 different judges. Now the judges weren't like in court. They weren't like your county commissioner or, something like that. Judges were people that God chose, filled with his spirit, and they became leaders of the people the people in Israel who at that point in time were in bondage to their enemies, and God used them And God was with them to help rescue the people and bring them back into that righteous relationship with God through the law and through the system of sacrifices. Now, how that happened was there was a cycle that took place with the first judge, and then it repeated itself 12 times, okay? The people would be following the law and being blessed and everything was good, but then they'd start to fade away a little bit. We're not going to go to church on the Sabbath. We're not going to give the money to the church that God asked us to give. We're not going to fellowship with our fellow believers in God. We're going to start fellowshipping with our neighbors, okay? Then it progresses a little bit more. Well, now we're fellowshipping with our neighbors. Our son wants to marry their daughter, so our son's going to marry their daughter, and they're going to have kids, and next thing you know, they're not worshiping God anymore, our God. They're worshiping their God, their pagan gods. So all of a sudden, they're saying, hey, those pagan gods, they're a lot more fun. They let us do a lot of things that God says is wrong that we like. We like to do those things. So instead of doing what God tells us to do, we're going to do the things that we think are right, that seem right to us, but God says are wrong, but they make us happy, and people should be happy. All people should be happy. Nobody should not be happy. So it doesn't matter. We're going to turn from God. We're going to reject God. We're going to reject God and God's teachings in order to make ourselves happy and worship the pagan gods. They do that, then in their eyes, in God's eyes, the things that are good become evil, and the things that God counts as evil to them becomes good. When that happens, God does what he told him to do. He said, if you do that, I'm going to bring judgment against you. And not only am I going to be against you, I'm going to raise up your enemies, and I'm going to be with them to help them defeat you. And he did. And he brought those enemies in, and those enemies put those people into captivity, put them into slavery, killed a lot of them. It was horrible for them, to the point that eventually the ones that were left would cry out and say, God, you had to rescue us. You know, we're sorry. We went away from your laws, and we went away from your teachings. We're sorry. Bring us back. So that's when God brought a judge. And God helped the judge defeat the enemies, bring the people back into, and the people repented of their sins, brought them back into that right relationship with God, and they were blessed again. That's cycle number one. It repeats itself 12 times over 400 years. 12 times. Different judges, different kinds of people God used. I used to tell the men, if you read the book of Judges, it's the only book in the Bible that I would say is X-rated for violence. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, it's illustrative of what happened, but man, that's tough. And after all of that happened, at the end of the book of Judges, I have one translation of the Bible, the last sentence in the book of Judges. What would you think it'd say? Would you think it'd say, and the people said, oh man, we're done. We better never stray from God again. We better follow the law. We better we better do everything we could do to be righteous in God's eyes after all of this. Nope. The last sentence says, and man did what was right in his own eyes. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, now, time out. In between the book of Judges and the next 6 books of the Bible that talk about a different period in history, there's a little book called Ruth. It's a sweet little book. I love it. If you have 15 or 20 minutes sometime, just read the book of Ruth. What a sweet story. what a neat story. And the neat thing about it is, if you read it, and you read the Bible more, you'll learn that Ruth ended up being King David's great grandmother. Okay, and because of that, Jesus was in the lineage of David. Okay, Ruth would have been one of Jesus's grandmothers on his family tree. Somebody you wouldn't expect to be in his family tree, but read the story; it's really cool. Okay, now we're at 1000 BC, and we're going to quickly get to 400 BC. What happens at the end of the book of Judges? The people at the beginning of the next book, which is 1 Samuel. Okay, the 6 books are 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, the next 6 books. And they describe the history of the period of kings for the next 500 years. Okay, it begins at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where the people go to Samuel, who's a high priest, is a priest at the time, and they say, okay, this isn't really working out very well for us, but we think it would be better if we had a king. So ask God if he'll give us a king. So Samuel goes to God and he talks to God about it, and God says, that's really a bad idea. That's really going to work out bad for them. But if they want a king, okay, I'll give them a king. So the first king got appointed and Samuel anointed was Saul. Didn't work out too good. The second king was King David. And those first 2 books, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, talk about basically that time period. Well, King David was a good king, and he had a great, an awesome relationship with God. Had his ups and downs, had his problems, but what God said about King David was that he was a man after God's own heart. So at that point in time with those kings, God was having a relationship with man through the law and through that system of sacrifices. That didn't change, but with the people and a king. Okay, now the next king, we get into the book of Kings and Chronicles. The next king is King Solomon, David's son. He was a great king, did awesome things, very smart guy. The nation was united under him, very prosperous, everything was great. He wasn't the most moral guy, and he really didn't follow the law exactly like he should have, but after Solomon, it got a lot worse, because the period of time after Solomon, the kingdom and the promised land split in 2. You have the northern kingdom Israel, the southern kingdom Judah. They had over the next 900 or 400 years or so, they had good kings occasionally, but mostly bad kings. Mostly kings who didn't follow the law but followed the pagan gods. Same cycle as the same stuff they were going through in the book of Judges. Same messes they were getting themselves into. After a couple hundred years, God just gave up on the northern kingdom, which was called Israel at the time. He allowed the Assyrians from the north to come in and conquer them, take them all out, spread them all over the world, and they put Assyrians in that part of the promised land. That only left the southern kingdom, Judah, okay, and they weren't much better, but they existed until 500 BC. And I mean, as that story goes, good king, bad king, bad king, good king. Eventually God said, okay, enough is enough. He brought the Babylonians over from the east. They conquered Judah and took almost all the people from Judah back to Babylon and put them in captivity in Babylon. Now, before I talk about the end of the end of the period of kings, okay, there's one thing also I want to mention quickly, and that's the prophets. Okay, we have seven in the Old Testament. We have 7 books of the prophets, or 17 books of the prophets, or the last books in the Old Testament. That the prophets were people that God sent to speak to the kings and speak to the people and tell them about, they're doing wrong, they're not following God, God's going to bring judgment, you need to repent, you need to turn around, you need to, get back to God, okay? And they just keep doing it and do it. And you know what the kings and the people did to the prophets. For the most part, they murdered them and threw them in prison. But thank God, at least we in our Bible in the Old Testament, we have 17 books of the prophets that show us, what was happening at that time and how God was speaking through those men and prophetically speaking through what they wrote to us. So it's interesting, a little complicated sometimes, but very interesting to read those books. Now, at 500 BC, we've got the people of Judah living in Babylon in captivity. Another power, Persia, comes and conquers Babylon, and they take some of those people and they take them to Babylon. Okay, at that point, we have the book of Esther. It's not in that exact order, but at that point we have events that took place in the book of Esther with those people living, Jewish people living in Persia. Esther was one of them. Another plug for one of my videos about the book of Esther, 180 Degrees. It's a great story. It's a true real life story for me, and it's tied directly to the book of Esther. Anyway, so we have the people living in Babylon and living in Persia. God raises up a guy named King Cyrus of Persia, and he makes King Cyrus sympathetic to the people, the Israelite people, and King Cyrus allows a group of those people to go back to the old promised land, go back to Jerusalem, which was the capital of the old promised land, and rebuild the city of Jerusalem and rebuild the temple where they worship God in the capital of Jerusalem. So those people came back, and that's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And those books end the historical portion of the Old Testament. So at that point, at 400 BC, we have the end of the writing in the book of the Old Testament. Now, we have, after that, before we get to the end of the BC period, we have a 400 year roughly period that takes place that talks about doesn't talk about anything. It says God was silent. Okay, people say God was silent during that time, but I don't think he was asleep. That's what I want to talk about. I believe that God was doing something during that time in order to prepare the world for what was about to happen in the AD period. What happened was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire came about during that time period, and the Roman Empire developed rapidly and took power over all of the area around the Mediterranean Sea. And what happened when they took that over, there wasn't a common language. All the groups of people had their own languages, but there was a language that developed that allowed them to communicate on a primary basis, to communicate with people all over. And a lot of people became, particularly business people, had to become proficient in their own language and proficient in the Roman language. So better communication all around the Mediterranean area, and the Romans developed way better logistics, roads, particularly the system of sea transport and scheduled shipping, bigger ships, more organized shipping that was taking place, trade during that 400-year period, trade around the Mediterranean and outside of the Mediterranean from the west, the western area of Europe and Western Africa, all the way to the east, to the Middle East, and beyond the Middle East, all the way into India and other areas. Trade routes developed, roads developed, shipping developed, and all that took place during that 400-year period before we come to the end of the Old Testament period and the period of time, which we measured in BC. And that brings us to the New Testament. And the New Testament is where part 2 begins. So see you later. See you in part 2. God bless you. Thanks for tuning in. Love you guys. Bye.